Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. If you'd like to join our writing community on Discord and get access to fantasy writing classes and books on Patreon, check the links in the description. And if you don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to follow or subscribe. And to support the show, leave a quick rating on Spotify or iTunes and share this episode on social media or with anyone who you think may be interested. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and Happy New Year. Welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. I'm your host, Richie Billing, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the Queen of Grimdark herself, the brilliant Anna Smith-Spark. Anna, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you. And yeah, I'm the first guest of 2025, which is lovely.
Yeah, it's starting off in the right way. But I do really appreciate you joining me. I've been reading The Woman of the Sword at the moment just because I'm working on something that has a mother figure in it, and it's just fantastic. The emotional connection between the mother and the children it just feels so real and authentic. And the main character, Lide, is it Lide? That's how I would pronounce it in my head. But
I say Lide, but I mean,
Lide,
there is no, there are so many characters in fantasy. Yeah, because I'm dyslexic. I'm one that I have to admit, quite a few of my favorite fantasy series. I do love fantasy names, but I'm like my favorite character, and their nemesis. And yeah, I mean, it's such a classic thing with fantasy names. No one has any idea how to pronounce them.
Yeah, but I can't. I thought it's like everyone. It almost becomes your own story then because you've got your own take on it.
Yeah,
I just always get really hesitant when I say it out loud in front of other people.
yeah.
um, but like the way that story is written, like she's such an interesting character with such a rich history, and you just want to know more. So you can't help but read on. And another one of my favorite books is Court of Broken Knives, and I think that's where what you showed me as a writer is how much you can experiment with style and structure and in a fantasy because it to be honest I've read a lot of classic fantasies like Fight Tolkien obviously and Game of Thrones like A Song of Ice and Fire. I absolutely adore them books, but you kind of did it your own way, and that's what I really loved. And it sort of encourages you to try different things. So yeah, I'm very excited to have you on, Anna. So where did it all begin? Like, what inspired you to be a writer?
Oh goodness! When it all began actually with the Court of Broken Knives. So I mean, it kind of began in my childhood with lots of like telling and retelling classic myths and fairy tales and folklore and children's fantasy books. And it was always fantasy stories I was telling myself, partly because I mean, it's that interesting thing for a lot of people. Classic children's books are fantastical and magical. If you ask someone to list classic children's books, almost all of them will involve magic. And then there's often that assumption when you grow up, you stop reading books like that. But which is really sad. But
Yeah,
yeah, so when I was a child, it was always I read a huge amount of fantasy and myth and mythology, and I tell myself stories based on those stories. And actually thinking about sort of almost always the main characters were actually people who turned into Marath and Thalia. But then I stopped writing completely when I was an adult, and it did begin with Court of Broken Knives, which is the first piece of fiction I read as an adult, and that just kind of just poured out. I mean, it's interesting
yeah,
that kind of people talk about. Yeah, I mean, people do sort of talk about the form and the fact it's doing different things, but it wasn't consciously intended at all.
yeah,
It just came pouring out of me in a year, the whole book, or the first draft of the whole book anyway. And all the kind of things like the way that it's told in the third person past tense, apart from the flashback chapters that are told in the in the third person present tense, but you but are kind of anonymous. they're just he and she, and then the Thalia's chapters, which are told in the first person present and all of that. That was not in any way a conscious decision. That just happened. It just
Yeah.
felt right when I was like writing. So when I was writing the first flashback scene chapter to Marith and Karen when they were younger, it just felt right writing that in the present tense, in the third person. And then when it I started writing about Thalia, and yeah, I mean she has some sections in the third person, but then it just felt right to start writing a piece that was her in the first person because it was just that was the right way to write it. It just wasn't kind of so it was none of it was conscious at all. It just came
Yeah.
blasting out of me. And then I mean again the kind of the fight scenes. So I mean I was actually really nervous about writing a fight scene for a long time. And I could do a whole podcast for like advice for people who are wanting to write fantasy but kind of scared about things like the fight scenes because I think fight scenes, magic systems, and sex are probably the three things that people are really quite nervous about because fight scenes particularly they're not something anyone's kind of had any experience in but as most of us have had much experience in but they're also something that people there's that whole genre of getting fight scenes writing them really technically and getting it right and then you
Yeah.
do meet a lot of people on the fantasy scene who do reenactment or who do HEMA or who do LARP or who so you kind of get that sense of like oh they kind of maybe they know what they're talking about. And then you meet someone who's been in the army as well, and there are people on the fantasy scene you meet who have been in the forces, and you're like, whoa. And it does feel really nerve wracking writing a fight scene for someone like me who has never been in a fight in my life. I mean, I do aerobics. It's the closest I've come to any kind of. Again, that's my physical activity. That's the closest I've literally. That's the closest I've ever come to being engaged in any kind of combat situation.
Have you ever felt
Um,
tempted to go out and do some first-hand research? Do you
no,
know, go
because
and start some fights in a pub?
I, yeah, because I'm actually I've got various hidden disabilities, so I mean I just couldn't. If someone I did just like kind of target archery once at an Outward Bound centre, and the instructor couldn't work out how I could hold the bow that badly because I just can't. And yeah, and I don't know left and right, so if someone was to say like hold your sword, like which hand do I hold my sword in? I don't know. But I mean, it's that bad. So when I came to write the fight scenes, I was actually for a long time I was really scared about the idea of writing a fight scene because I felt really nervous around it. And I
Yeah.
was kind of almost trying to avoid writing a big full-on battle because I was so nervous about it would all be wrong and I didn't know what I was doing. And then I was just like, okay, I just need to do this. And I just kind of went with it and discovered actually I seem to be quite good at it. And
Yeah.
but it wasn't again, it wasn't kind of and then the battle scenes just ramped up and ramped up and ramped up, and the fight scenes did get more intense. But that wasn't kind of intended either. It wasn't that I wanted. That was just the way it turned out that I somehow saw and thought. I mean, yet none of it was planned at all, and none of it was conscious at all. And then obviously later on with the other books in the trilogy, and with the Woman with the Sword, which is kind of a sequel, um, that was there was a kind of established style and an established world. But then when I came to write a sort of Bronze and Ashes, that in fact, which is my new series, which is more kind of folklory, that slight change of language and the sort of slight change of style again wasn't conscious. I didn't kind of think now I need to write. Okay, I've done this. Now I need to write something which is slightly different. It just sort of happened. I
Yeah.
just sat down and started writing, and that was the way it came out. And that again was written, that started as a very, very just kind of intense blast of writing with
Yeah.
this story just blasting out. And that's kind of how I always work. I don't really think about it. I don't kind of plan it. It just happens and either it doesn't happen, which is painful, or it does. And then yeah. But yeah, no, it's all very organic.
It's fascinating, yeah. It's just like she feels very natural. And have you ever, when you're in those situations, do you just literally just trust what comes out? Or do you ever second guess yourself and think, oh, is this the right idea? Or how, what are them moments like?
I have when it's going well, I just write it and I trust myself.
Yeah,
If I find myself thinking like, oh, I don't know, well, that's the point when I know this is not working. So I mean, I can tell anyway. To be honest, I feel really ill and frustrated when it's not working. I
yeah,
can honestly feel quite physically not well and just really down and not right when it's not working. But then when it is working, I do kind of know. And I mean, it's because you've got to keep the energy up to keep writing. I was sort of giving someone some advice about who is trying to make time to write, and it is that. I mean, part of it's almost you have to have that belief. If you start second guessing yourself and constantly rewriting stuff and sort of not feeling confident enough to go on, then you're never going to get anywhere from a practical point of view. So you have that's, but yeah, I can usually tell if I'm constantly guessing myself. If I'm looking at it thinking, oh, I don't know, then I just know that's the point. I need to just get rid of it. And unfortunately, I'm quite good at just getting rid of it.
yeah,
I'm quite good at, so I edit a lot as I'm going on, and I'm quite good at self editing. And I think that's a really important thing to be able to do because when you can tell it's not quite right, you you need to stop as soon as possible because otherwise it just gets worse and worse. You get further and further away from where it should be, where you
yeah,
think it should be, and you just go on. And I think you get into kind of a bit of a spiral where it's just getting worse. And I think you probably just need to actually trust your instinct that it's not working. You need to cut a whole load of stuff and start again, which is
Would
really
you,
depressing advice. But
yeah, would you identify that more as a pantser?
oh yes, yes,
Yeah. So you
completely.
just discover your way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so when I start a new thing, I never have any idea. Always start all my this kind of series I've started, all the kind of connected books I've started. So Empires of Dust, and then A Woman of the Sword, which is slightly separate, and then the new series, which is The Making of This World Ruined, the first book, which is called Sword of Bronze and Ashes. Yeah, each one began with a scene. So there was first of all, the very first thing was just when I started writing Quarter Broken Knives, I didn't even had a sense I was writing a novel. It was just a scene of these men in the desert. And then, spoiler alert, although this is chapter two in my first ever book, so but a dragon turns up, and a dragon turns up within about I think 3 pages,
Yeah.
and that it was like, okay, this is probably a fantasy novel in that case. I mean, it's probably a novel because it seems to be fiction, but I mean, it could be a short story. But and then it just went from there. And at the time, I had no idea who any of these people were, and they were introducing. So had no idea who Marith was until he turned up, and suddenly this young man turned up and killed a dragon, and the whole of the book just sort of developed. And I kind of write, and I have no idea what I'm doing, I have no idea who these people are, I have no idea what's going on. And similarly so Sword of Bronze and Ashes began with just a description of a woman in a particular valley walking down to a river, and I had no idea who she was, I had no idea what was going on. And then I suddenly just get to a point where I can see the whole thing,
Yeah.
and I know exactly what the whole thing's about and where it's going and what it's and that's this kind of wonderful feeling where it's all revealed to me. Yeah, it's kind of it really is almost like sort of laboring up a mountain, and then you get to the top and you look out at the view.
And it's all there.
Yeah, so it's quite a painful process and a
It
chaotic
sounds,
process.
yeah. I imagine it works for everyone's different, aren't they? And I think one of the most important things is learning your own process and what works best for you. And it sounds like it
Yeah,
is super effective because I love pantsing, just sitting there and just writing and seeing where it takes you. And as time has gone on, I've definitely moved more towards doing that. And it's so liberating, isn't it? And I don't know, there's definitely, I mean, if you don't know where the story's going, it's harder for the reader to know where the story's going. That's one of the biggest benefits I've found.
yeah. I mean, yeah, there's a real freedom in just writing. I mean, I often say to people about writing that kind of the best tip I can give people actually is to write, not to write for, I'm writing a book. and I don't know what people are going to think of it, and try and get that critic that's thinking of it as your writing as doing something to create a finished product,
Yeah.
like the way you're writing, like the way you're doing something at work. When you're doing something at work,
Yeah.
you have particular guidelines, and you're obviously doing that, and you have to do it in the way your line manager wants, or whatever, or the customer wants, or whoever. And there's that real worry about, is my line manager going to like this, or is the customer going to like this, or whatever. But when you're writing, you just need to. So people dance like you might dance late at night at your best mate's wedding. You're not dancing for, and you're just
Yeah.
dancing because you're dancing for the sheer pleasure of dancing and because you're happy, or singing for the same. You write because you enjoy it, and just write what you enjoy, and write for the love of writing, and
Yeah.
don't think about, is this working to market, or kind of what will my beta do, will my beta readers like this, or kind of, is this hitting the right notes for this particular
Yeah.
subgenre or these tropes. Something, just write for the sheer pleasure of telling the story you want to tell, and that will give an energy and enjoyment to your writing that means the reader will probably enjoy it more. And yeah, don't
Yeah.
write for readers, just write for yourself, essentially, and just have fun, enjoy it, and have fun with it. But also think, I do think about it a lot. I say to people, I don't know where the book's going, but I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
I It's the kind of excitement, and it's almost like trying to work it out, like the way, I don't know, if you're reading a detective novel, you often, I don't know, I always find myself thinking about it and trying to work it out and puzzle it out, and distracted, like in a boring meeting, distracted, trying to puzzle out who the murderer is. And write your own books like that, right? And then when you're not writing, think about it. Essentially try and puzzle your own book out in the way
Yeah.
you might with other people. And that kind of, because again, it's that sort of energy of, well, why did I write that last scene? Why is this character doing this? What's going on? And of course, the other thing about pantsing is you can go back afterwards. So people sort of, I don't know, I don't want to give people some amazing impression that, something, like there's some minor detail that happens on page 3 of one of my books that kind of, like 3 books later at the end, is revealed as being really significant. Like, gosh, how did she know? No, she wrote it, she had no idea. And then 3 books later, it was like, it fell into place. Well, it's possible some of that was added afterwards. There's a lovely bit. It was Hilary Mantel actually talked about how she would go back, and like, if she realized there was a particular image that she wanted to stress in the book, she'd go back through her book and kind of weave the image in and out occasionally. Not a huge amount, but she could spend like weeks going back to nearly finished text and just very occasionally weaving in one particular image or one particular phrase or something that was important, that she'd realized later was really important in the book.
Yeah.
And then spend a lot of time thinking about, like, is it too much? Not like I'm going to put in a reference to this particular symbol on every page, but just carefully weaving it through, and really carefully reading through the whole manuscript to see exactly how many times this thing needed to be in, and how it worked. And almost like, kind of, I don't know, like, I don't know, sort of doing the finishing touches on your home decoration, or like, I don't know, finishing touches on a piece of embroidery or something, like the final tiny details that you need after everything's done. And that, yeah, you pants it, but then you do kind of go back over it. As I said, self-edit it a lot and think about it, and kind of work stuff back in and things. And but it is amazing, if you pants it, how much stuff is there in your subconscious that
Yeah.
kind of, yeah. And just really bizarre things. Like, I find it really uncomfortable if a character's name isn't quite right. I find it really, really hard to write. So I'm always changing characters' names, or
Yeah.
and then suddenly, like, yeah, that's who they are, that's their name, and that's the point where everything just completely falls into place, and suddenly you understand them, so the whole thing can just go on.
Yeah. And what about with characters? Like, how do you get to know your characters? Do you just literally like put them through the paces in the story and figure them out as you go along that way?
Yeah, again, I think about them a lot.
Yeah.
And then they're all kind of, I don't, some people I know character build and virtually kind of create mood boards and things for different characters. I don't do that, but I think, some they're all different aspects of me. So as I said, Marathon Thalia were with me actually my whole life. So I used to tell myself a lot of sort of traditional fantasy, fairy tale, folklore stories, which are always about a prince and a princess, kind of as a lot of folklore and fantasy and traditional children's stories are, or a, and all the they were all of those characters. The prince was always Maryllis was Marith, and the princess was always Thalia. So they would just be with me my whole life. And then Lide is very much based on me. A Woman of the Sword is a really autobiographical book, a really confessional book. And then Lakanda in A Sword of Bronze and Ashes is kind of me as I like to be. She's the kind of person I really aspire to be and want to be. And so they're all different facets of me or different parts of me. And then I don't kind of map out the characters, they just sort of happen. I mean, their different voices just somehow happen quite organically. And then I get quite into them as well. So I guess I mean, yeah, I kind of really inhabit the way that they're thinking. And I do find myself, I would, when I was writing Empires of Dust, I was so into their different heads. It would be this kind of like, okay, I'm writing a lot about Mareth at the moment. I'd be almost like, how would he think about things in daily life? And sort of trying to think like him in the rest of my life. Or when I was thinking, like, when I was writing chapters with Tobias, I could almost feel like the way I was speaking to people was shifted, and I was speaking to people more like he would.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, it's that kind of sense of just, they're all just, I guess they just happen for me. What I
Yeah.
find with minor characters that's quite useful is often a very minor character. I actually often name them as an in joke for someone I know or something,
Yeah.
or just, and then they just suddenly they just got that life to them because they're like I relate them to real persons. They have a kind of life to them that I know because they're because they
Yeah.
kind of exist. Not in, I mean, I do. I'm one of those writers that just sort of observes people all the time as well. There's that joke people talk about like, God, don't, if you know a writer, be careful what you say around them because it'll end up in a book.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I'm like that. I try and pick up things that people have said and store them up
Yeah.
as things. Yeah, so that gives the characters a sort of realism as well. But yeah, I think I just kind of write the characters as they come and
It's
kind
an
of
interesting point that you make there about bringing life to them very minor characters because I agree with you completely. It adds so much color to the story and the world when you can just give that little bit of detail. And you mentioned one little trick. Like, have you used any other like methods? Like, I mean, I like to give them nicknames or maybe just half a sentence. Just you give them a nickname and then explain why they got the nickname, or some kind of detail that is gonna be better than just like a man with brown hair or something.
yeah, there's that. Yeah, there's just giving them that little life. So just that sense of, yeah, there's something about them, a little kind of life or an interest or something. And you don't even need to write in the book. Although actually, I often sort of say to people that kind of working bit. So you often the bits you might edit out later, where you've got some really minor character, and you
Yeah.
realise you've given them a two-page backstory that they really didn't need, and you just cut that out. But because it's there for you, and so like
Yeah.
so it gives them a kind of depth. I mean, Tobias obviously isn't minor; he's a very major character in Empires of Dust. But he's because I know all kinds of stuff about his background and his childhood that actually, I mean, really stupid things that actually, I suppose I did do some character mood boards and that I did things like I did an interview. There's a really rather cool blog site where someone does an interview from your point of view of one of your characters. So I did an interview from Tobias's perspective. So there's all this kind of stuff
Yeah.
about, and I did one from also from Gertie uh, in the Shadow They're Dying, the novella I wrote with Michael R. Fletcher. So again, there's sort of stuff in there that was about I just sort of about like her past that's got nothing to do with the novella and has no bearing on the novella at all. But because I know it, it's just there's just a slight richness and depth to her that yeah. So if you sort of things like so, I mean, Tobias is a weaver, and that is mentioned in Puzzle Dust. So I used the language he was using. He talked quite naturally about using metaphors to do with weaving and dyeing cloth and things because that's the way he thinks. So as soon as you start thinking
Yeah,
about that kind of thing about your character, like what's this character's background? How are they thinking? They might be different from someone else's character, some of the other characters around them. That just gives it a slight. I mean, it's sort of it's almost like the kind of differences in, I guess, in things like dialect or in language words. I mean, the sort of things about English, all those sort of jokes about different social classes and people from different parts of the country and whether you use serviette or napkin or whether you talk
yeah,
about all that, all that stuff about different words for bread rolls
yeah.
and
Cobs.
all that
I
sort of
call them a
yes,
cob.
yep.
What do you
And
call them?
I call them a bread roll
Red roll.
because yes, because I speak the Queen's because I was brought up to speak the
We
Queen's
have
English.
we have
Bread roll.
Barms as well.
Yeah,
Barms
but
cobs.
all of that, and obviously, if you get this totally kind of, you don't want to do your reader in completely with like, what the hell is this
Yeah,
character talking about? But you have those little details. Where, okay, this character would use, yeah, this character would talk about bread cakes or balms. This character obviously talks about bread rolls. Now, this character you would use the equivalent of serviette. This character would use the equivalent of napkin.
yeah,
This character is that, and then as soon as you've got those kind of different sense of where your characters are coming from. Yeah, you've got just a thing that just you've got a whole sense of actually their work of where they're coming from, which is more interesting, yeah, than they've got brown hair. And
yeah,
it's actually more interesting than giving them some massive tragic backstory or something either, because you're just making them ordinary people who just more often actually try and use a bit of emphasis on other people, on people I know and things, because yeah, I mean they're real people. As soon as they're not, so yeah, you're just basing them on perfectly average real people that you know,
yeah,
not basing on, but because they've got some link to them. They've got a kind of they've got a whole life and a reality
yeah.
and a solidity.
There you go. It is. I completely agree. It's fantastic. And one thing I wanted to ask you is about Grimdark. So you're very much associated with the subgenre.
Yes.
Can you tell us all about it? Because it's something that we've never discussed on the show. I absolutely love Grimdark and read all the time. But yeah, it's never been covered and it's so popular.
I actually often just say to people it's more realistic fantasy.
Yeah,
It's it's because I mean I read a lot of historical fiction as well, and historical fiction is never almost never about sort of good and bad in the way that a lot of classic fantasy is. It's never
yeah,
simple in the way that a lot of classic heroic fantasy is, because obviously real history is very seldom good or bad, and it's certainly never simple. So I mean, things like Game of Thrones, at the beginning, it's is some he's trying to tell a real, much more realistic story about kind of the way that I mean, it's based on the Wars of the Roses, which is obviously a very complicated period of British history where it's very difficult to say you can't people are obviously in somehow people have that instinctive sense that they are either the House of York or the House of Lancaster in some really bizarre way. Most
yeah,
people in the end will somehow tell you something about, oh yeah, Richard III, or oh yeah, kind of, yeah, Edward the fourth. For some reason people, or yeah, Henry, sort of for some reason people come out on one side or the other, or but but that's not for any kind of moral reasons. And also that, but then he's also trying to tell them to be realistic about it. So the kind of that wonderful moment in Feast for Crows where oh God, I can't remember his name, the youngest of the Baratheon brothers just dies. Okay, he just
Renly, is it?
dies in Renly, yes, he just dies. And okay, so he's just dies by magic, by sort of evil magic assassination. But
Yeah,
that reality of this kind of, you're having this, this person is poised and it looks like they're about to win the kingdom, and then sadly they just keel over and die of some disease which was at that time incurable, or they literally just fall off their horse or whatever.
yeah,
And it's that randomness that you get these characters that, or kind of, I mean, obviously Rob Stark is the really massive example where everyone was so shocked by his death. And the point is that kind of, again, okay, so it possibly didn't happen in quite as dramatic circumstances as that, but you've got this whole narrative built up of this guy who's clearly going to be this young, handsome hero. We've had all these books. We've gone through a book and a half setting you up as the hero,
Yeah,
and then he just died. And again, that is absolutely realistic and much more kind of historically realistic than the kind of the Aragorn narrative where he's the chosen one and nothing, so we know, it's all going to work out.
yeah,
So a lot of that kind of, and again, the kind of violence and the horror of Grimdark. Grimdark is it's writing about war as it really is, rather than that kind of, there is that kind of absurd element of some classic fantasy where sort of heroic fantasy where it's all kind of weirdly hygienic war and almost kind of weirdly just, the baddies are just so bad and our
yeah,
heroes are so heroic, and it almost kind of feels like this is battle without consequence.
yeah. There's
And that kind of, all those kind of ridiculous where everyone's so powerful that kind of they can always defeat the bad guy. And that was, real war is, talking about the reality of what happens in war and what happens in turbulent society. And again, the sort of, it's Grimdark for me is actually just realistic. Now, I mean,
yeah,
you might say when you read, a lot of people say they read heroic fantasy because they want to read something in which good triumphs. They don't want to read something. It's fantasy. The clue's in the name. But
yeah,
I find it really much more intellectually satisfying. So I read something more complicated.
yeah. I completely agree. Yeah,
And I do also enjoy writing really massively complicated battles.
I think the characters are much more
Yeah,
interesting as well.
yeah. I mean, it's more. I think it's a more round. It's giving interestingly rounded characters, making them seem more kind of complex and rounded and problematic in the sense that they're not. Sometimes there is also, I mean, there's the enjoyment of writing a character who is just evil.
Yeah,
I mean, sort of something like, Prince. Sort of that's there's an enjoyment in a book like that because it is a fantasy of the self that would be free of inhibitions. It's fantasy in that sense. It's fantasy in kind of, if you actually were involved fantasy roaming party, the sheer untrammeled pleasure of just the fantasy of just being able to kind of charge around butchering everyone because you've got a magic sword and you're very good at fighting and you're kind of, and you're a level 5 and you're a level 10 warrior and everyone else around you are kind of level 1 NPCs. Obviously, that it's that kind of fantasy element of enjoying and exploring the sort of the untrammeled dark side of your character, which obviously, I mean, I enjoyed writing about Marith greatly as well, just kind of completely going for it. But yeah, so I think it's a mixture of kind of, but it also does make for kind of slightly richer, more complicated characters.
Grimdark in the world. I always find the world's a lot of grittier, but a lot more vivid and real. Like sometimes, like you say, sometimes the world and they are just like too hygienic and everything's just cooked
Yeah,
clean and
yes,
perfect.
yes.
But you like to see people living
I
in
mean, there's an element.
squalor and
Well, people generally did, but I mean, it can get too far. There's that kind of some grimdark worlds where like every single like no everyone you go into a tavern and the food is inevitably disgusting and the beer is inevitably rancid and everyone is inevitably really horrible. And there's that it can go too far, but it is, I think in some ways it's that kind of relatableness in the same way that something like that kind of British humorous tradition of things being crap, the kind of Monty Python, men behaving badly, The Office, all of that is basically predicated on people being rubbish and things generally being a bit rubbish and disappointing and life being pretty crap, and people are being fairly sort of trapped in their crap lives. Um, and that it's relatable. There's a sense that you can kind of get it's real in a sense that kind of something that's kind of glossy, yeah, and hygienic just somehow isn't that kind of inevitable sense of disappointment that you're really hungry and you go into it and you're really, really hungry and you go into a tavern and the food's horrible. And is that it is the kind of relatableness to it, that kind of sense of a real world that I think is it's fun to write, but it's also and it can go too far. But
Yeah.
yeah, it does give it, I think, a kind of grounding in a slightly more kind of real way. And I mean, again, people might say, well, it's fantasy. And I enjoy writing the kind of absurd high fantasy, the sort of romances in the old sense of the term, where it is just about absurd beauty. I mean, it that kind of sort of Tolkien, Lothlorien, this is just, absurdly, impossibly beautiful and over the top and just so kind of just absurd in its beauty and its wonder. But
Yeah.
that's almost the kind of you can have both. I think that's where Grimdark goes too far sometimes, is it's a world of absolute squalor, that kind of where you can have the low, but then you also have the breathtaking beauty of the highness and the kind of the wonder, which
Yeah.
again is kind of real in our lives. I think those kind of moments of sublime wonder,
Yeah.
almost kind
Definitely.
of contrasted with and then almost the same moment, the kind of absurdity and the kind of rubbishness of it all. And I think there is a kind of depth to of a world like that you don't get in a world which is kind of either one or which is just not going to either extreme.
Yeah. Have you got any tips for writers when it comes to building worlds? It is quite a tricky thing, isn't it? I know a lot of people struggle with it.
See, I don't world build. I don't do any world building either. I just write,
Yeah.
and the world comes out as I'm writing. And
Nice.
actually, which I sometimes think makes my world slightly more realistic in a weird kind of way, or more plausible, because it's not logically constructed. I haven't logically set it out. And actually, again, reality isn't logical. They don't have that kind of planned logic behind them. Most societies are fairly organic and they've got lots of different interpretation. People will often understand the same society in slightly different ways, have different explanations for how things operate, see things in different ways. And then, of course, most societies have got people with multiple cultural backgrounds, and then within those different cultural backgrounds, different narratives about those cultural backgrounds themselves. So it's all a kind of chaos.
Yeah.
So I try and think about the one thing I always feel slightly self-conscious is I'm sure that people would point out that some of the kind of, the geology and ecology of Empires of Dust is just a boiling hot tropical forest right next to a sort of cold, arid plain, because that wouldn't work. But but so I try and root it in real. I mean, I try and root places in real places.
Yeah.
So often when I'm describing a bit of countryside, I try and describe it somewhere that I know. So I've got the kind of topography in my head and and a sense of what is important within the landscape in my own head.
Yeah.
So most of the places that are of significance in my books are real places that mean something to me. But within that, also because I'm writing them from different characters' perspectives, and again, we all see places differently. So
Mm.
how the different characters see the same place is written through how they see it. So they possibly know different things about a place as well. So, but it is again, it's all completely organic. It comes out, and it's what matters to the characters. And then
Nice.
obviously, I make a lot of notes. So once someone's been somewhere, obviously that's what that place looks like. And then the other characters, then I make lots and lots of notes on going on. And I'm
Yeah.
lucky in that I can keep it all in my head. I can see the world I'm writing really, really clearly, and it stays in my head. I'm not lucky in that it crowds out everything else. So I will sit there in meetings and not clue how something that people are talking about. I have no memory at all of the meeting I was in last week where we discussed this, and I'll sit there and be like, really? I was asked to do that? Oh, sorry. And have that no kind of, I kind of, because my head is just full of my world. But
Yeah,
a kind of organicness of it, I think, actually does kind of give it a depth. It is all just things that mean something to me. If there's some anything is in there, it's because it means something. So it therefore has solidity to it. But yeah, but also it's not kind of structured. It's not about how my world works, which I think is helpful
yeah,
because it doesn't it doesn't mean I'm focusing on. It means I'm not focusing on the story and the. I'm focusing on what I'm writing, not on trying to kind of build a manual for someone else for a world that for a role playing game or something. It's
yeah,
focusing on what matters in the story. But then, I mean, other people do really do a lot of world building, and if people enjoy world building, then that's as we're saying. There's always different ways of writing, whichever works for someone. But
yeah,
yeah, that's what works for me. And I get again, I think people get quite hung up. You do get a feeling that some people who really want, there are people who want to write, who want to start writing, but feel really nervous about creating a secondary world
yeah.
because of this real fear that they're not doing it right, or it's not going to be good enough, or someone's going to notice some minor detail. And I actually sometimes think when people are doing world building, you can kind of tell. So I love a good info dump. I love a bit where someone tells me some great thing about how the world works. I love books with, all the stuff with appendices and all that kind of stuff. I love all of that. I would, because I'm reading it to go and live in another world. I love fantasy because it's taking you to another world. So I certainly, I love all of that stuff. You can tell when someone's a bit embarrassed and feels that they need to kind of justify something. And that you kind of, they're sort of, you can tell when people are kind of feeling they need to kind of explain something, something about the way their world works in a slightly different way because they're worried that people are going to say, oh, this isn't plausible, or oh, this is not, I don't know how this works. And it's when, I think when people just skate over it and just go with it as, okay, this is how the world operates. Within my world, magic works like this, or within my world, people can do this or whatever, and just go with it.
So one question I would like to ask every writer is what was your biggest challenge and how did you overcome it?
Oh my goodness, my biggest. So I mean, so, as I said, in some ways, right back at the beginning, actually writing a big battle scene or a fight scene was actually what I found really unnerving because it wasn't something I'd done. I'd ever had any
Yeah,
real experience, and that so I felt really anxious about it because obviously, and because I mean, it's one of the few things when you're writing that you really, if you're someone like me who has not done any kind of reenactment or martial arts or even like, but done camping trips or anything, I'm, I that kind of whole side of fantasy is something that I know about theoretically through non-fiction, but it's not something I have any practical experience of. But and it was a big thing for me to actually just go with that and write that and think, okay, I can do this,
yeah,
and I've got to do this because I'm by now it's pretty clear to me that I'm writing big epic fantasy, a Grimdark, which has got a battle in it, so I've got to go there. And it was, and I so was tiptoeing around trying to put it off, and then I just did it. And I think it comes back to writing for the pleasure of it. It comes sort of silencing the inner critic who's telling you to not do this or to be this is rubbish or to just it is that point of just doing it for your own sheer enjoyment of doing it and banishing the voice that's telling you this might not be any good or but what about this or what about that or I'm not convinced by this or I mean and actually in some ways as I've had more and more reviews you kind of get more and more conscious of it
Yeah.
because obviously when I was first writing the couple of first chapters of the Court of Broken Knives, I was just writing. It just was like, this is just a thing I'm doing for myself. And then later I was writing it thinking like, oh, this is quite good. I think I could probably get this published. But then by the time you're writing your sixth published book, you're like, oh, what if the reviews say, but this one is not as good as the last one? And you're more and more aware of reviews, and you're more and more aware, in fact, of voices saying, but there is an implausibility about this plot, or oh, but these characters are just some of the characters are not very well drawn out, and you're more used to that negative language of criticism, so you feel it more and more.
Yeah.
And it is ignoring that, just absolutely silencing that inner voice. Someone's told me he often writes when he's a little tired, when he's quite tired, because that shuts the inner voice up because he's just writing rather than it. And someone said actually they often they have a beer and then they write because it's that.
Nice.
I mean, I wouldn't
This Stephen
think
King
of
Grease.
writing, but it is that kind of different ways of silencing that voice in your head, which is saying like, "But this isn't very good," or "This could be better," or kind of
Yeah. That's a good
yeah.
voice to have when you're editing.
It's a good voice to have when you're editing, but even then, it's not good. In some ways, it's not a good voice to have when you're editing because you're reduced to like,
Yeah.
oh my god, this entire book is just rubbish. I'll just delete it. But
Delete it
it is
all.
just that kind of it is that getting into that point where you can just write for the pleasure of writing and silence all of those fears. And we all have them. So actually, a lot of people have real anxiety about building a convincing secondary fantasy world and world building and how your magic works and all of that. But then actually, it's interesting. I remember actually, I'm sure Adrian Tchaikovsky said one of the books he found hardest to write was his book that set actually parts of it are set in the real world. The Doors of Eden, that's what it's called. The Doors of Eden. So part of that is set on Bodmin Moor. And suddenly he's got this whole like, oh my God, this has to be right. When you're writing fantasy or science fiction, you can kind of make it up because
Yeah.
you're making it up. But as soon as you start writing about actual places and since you start writing about the country that you and most of your readers live in at the time that you and most of your readers are living in it, that you're saying actually it's unnerving because people are like, but that's just wrong.
Yeah.
Because suddenly you can see like, no one behaves
Yeah.
like that. And that's just really interesting because you always have that voice. You sort of think like my world is totally implausible. And then you're like, yeah, but my real world is even, but now I'm writing about 21st century Britain. It's even worse. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's just really kind of, so people never stop having that voice. So now, and you'd think I've had some absolutely amazing reviews and you think I feel like, oh, this is amazing. But now I'm like, my God, it's never going to live up to the last one. And
Yeah.
you never silence that voice. And you have to silence that voice because it's just, it is horrible. And because it's bearing your soul. If you're writing, really writing, you are writing something much more personal. So it is much harder to deal with than, I mean, I'm sure we've all had day job work where you're thinking like, oh God, I know perfectly well my line manager is going to tell me this is a bit rubbish. Or indeed you think this is excellent. Then your line manager comes back and tells you, I'm sorry, you're going to have to start again. And that's painful. But the voice in your head, that I still have that voice constantly. And as I said, in fact, I think it's got worse. But you just have to silence it and just make it go away and stop it.
That's
And that
fantastic advice.
I can't tell you how to do that. I'm not sure. As I said, someone I know recommends writing after you've had a beer or two, which I'm sure it's absolutely. I should not. I don't drink at all, so I do not do that. So I'm not encouraging you to do that. But it's. Yeah,
Have a
I can
shot
see
of
why I should
tequila.
do that. Yeah.
Shot of tequila, hit the keyboard.
Yes. Yes.
And another shot every 500 words.
Yes.
Well, Anna, thank you very much. It's been fantastic chatting with you. You've shared so many insights. I feel like I've learned so much just listening to you, and I always like catching
Oh,
your
goodness.
panels on at FantasyCon as well, because again, packed with insight. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm actually helping to organise World Fantasy Con, which is in Brighton in on the Halloween weekend this year. So that will be Fantasy Con, but more. And yeah, so that yes, just to promote that
Amazing.
to everyone. And that will be
Yeah,
very much about kind of yeah, that was very the lots of the panels in that will be very much about kind of sort of high level discussion about the craft and the kind of business of writing and things from a kind of practitioner's point of view. So yeah, that should be a really, really good convention.
yeah. You always learn something new.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Where's the best place to learn more about yourself?
I'm on. So I'm now. I have come off X because I just felt I couldn't
Yeah.
anymore. So I'm on Facebook. Although that, yeah, my big like, hey, I'm going to come off X and stay on Facebook went really well, obviously. Decision.
Yeah.
So I'm on Facebook as Anna Smith Spark. I'm on Blue Sky as Anna Smith Spark or Queen of Grimdark, and Instagram. So yeah, those are the places I tend to post stuff. I do have a website called Broken Knives, not .net, which is a fairly rubbish website because I'm not good at that kind of stuff at all. I'm definitely one of those people. I can write, but I cannot do anything else, and I certainly cannot cope with websites. But yeah, so I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky and Facebook, and I post stuff, and I do have my website for. There's some nice readings on there and some nice pictures and things.
Amazing. There you go. I'll put all the links in the description. Thank you everyone for listening at home.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. If you'd like to join our writing community on Discord and get access to fantasy writing classes and books on Patreon, check the links in the description. And if you don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to follow or subscribe. And to support the show, leave a quick rating on Spotify or iTunes and share this episode on social media or with anyone who you think may be interested. Thank you very much for listening.